Welcome, everybody. I see everybody sort of streaming in. We're going to give it a couple of seconds just to make sure everybody is sort of through the virtual door before we take in their virtual seat, before we really jump in. But yeah, let's give it another couple of seconds. Okay. I know more people are going to be sort of coming in here as I go over my introduction, but I think maybe at this point, some people purposefully come in 3 minutes late, so they don't need to hear me introduce things again and again and again. So welcome, everybody. My name is Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. And I'm really excited for the continuation of the series that we just started just this fall with the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland and the Western Reserve Historical Society, which is a series of lectures about Cleveland civics and Cleveland history. And I'm especially excited for February, Black History Month. It was a priority to make sure that we talk about one of the most distinguished African-American Clevelanders, and Regennia Williams is here to tell us all about Charles Chesnutt tonight. Before I introduce her and toss everything over to her, though, I did want to just go over the etiquette for the evening. This is a webinar, so we'll only be able to see and hear from Regina, but we still want to hear your questions and we still want you to participate. And so you can do that one of two ways. You can either write your questions and your comments in the chat button, or also in the Q&A down below. And one of the things, again, that I love about Zoom is that you don't need to wait until the question and answer period to ask your questions. And so if 3 slides in, you see something that makes you, that rises a question in your head, you can type it in and it'll be there primed and ready for us when we get to that period. So with that, I am really excited. Our speaker tonight is so dynamic and knows all about this, and I'm so excited to sort of settle in and listen to this lecture. It's another thing too, I should say, that as sad as I am that we're doing all of these, that we're not in person and seeing each other, it's so nice to have Zoom to be able to do this virtually. And even tonight, I was thinking as I shoveled my driveway for hours today, like, I wonder how many people would actually show up to a lecture tonight if it were live. And the fact that it's virtual is actually kind of nice every once in a while. But Dr. Regennia Williams is currently the Distinguished Scholar of African-American History and Culture at the Western Reserve Historical Society. She is a 2-time recipient of Fulbright Awards. And from 1993 until 2015, she served as a faculty member in the Department of History at Cleveland State University, where she got tenure and was promoted to associate professor. She's also taught part-time at Montgomery College, Dyke College, Cuyahoga Community College, the University of the District of Columbia, and Ashland Theological Seminary. And as an award-winning historian, she is also the founder, president, and director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Spirituality in the History of Africa and the Diaspora, which was established in 2016. And so with that, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for joining us tonight and for giving us this presentation about Charles Chesnutt.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for choosing to spend part of this snowy day in Cleveland, Ohio, participating in this Cleveland Civics History series devoted to the study of the life and the work of Charles Waddell Chesnutt, the civic life of a Cleveland creative, circa 1899 to 1929. Now, these are some of the things that I want to say about him before we get too far into the scripted portion of this presentation. But I want to thank all of the program sponsors, beginning with Case Western Reserve University and the Siegel Lifelong Learning Office, the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, and certainly the Western Reserve Historical Society, headquartered at the Cleveland History Center, especially to Whitney Stallnecker who works with all of us, those of us who like to do these Zoom presentations. She keeps us focused and she handles a lot of the logistics, and I really appreciate the help that she provides for me. Certainly, our friends at Cleveland Public Library are always helpful. We call it the People's University for a reason. There's a lot of learning that takes place in the world, now primarily in virtual settings, but Cleveland Public Library also hosts wonderful programs, and they are home to a great collection that focuses on the Chestnut family, not just Charles Waddell Chesnutt. And they have those materials thanks to his middle daughter, Miss Helen Chestnut, who I want to acknowledge this evening. For many years, she taught at Central High School here in the city of Cleveland, and she's also her father's biographer. But she was a great writer and a great teacher of Latin, according to Langston Hughes, who was one of her former students at Central High School. So definitely want to acknowledge those individuals and those organizations. And certainly I want to dedicate the presentation to one of my favorite people of all time, the late Dr. A. Grace Lee Mims, who was also a CWRU alumna. In 1953, she graduated from the School of Library Science, and her master's thesis was on Charles Waddell Chesnutt, his works and their significance. And after earning that graduate degree, she went on to have a wonderful career as a librarian in Cleveland in public schools, most notably the Glenville High School. And then beyond the work in the school libraries and the public libraries, she was a great vocalist and an educator at the Cleveland Music School Settlement. And that's where I met her. And that's how I used to look in 2014 when we took this picture in her living room, and all that beautiful artwork that's on the walls behind us, and all of her papers were recently donated by her family to the Western Reserve Historical Society. So the first installment of 67 boxes arrived in November of 2020. And there are other materials that we hope to acquire very soon. And I'm hoping, as I work with the family to prepare the inventory of those materials before they are moved to the African American Archives at the Western Reserve Historical Society, I'm hoping I come across a copy of that master's thesis, because I can't read the one that's in archives at the Western Reserve University right now because of COVID-19. Only students, faculty, and people who have CWRU IDs are admitted. So the alums and everybody else will have to wait their turn. Again, I hope I find my own copy, or at least a historical society copy of that particular thesis by Dr. A. Grace Lee at that time, when we get the materials from her family and have them at the Western Reserve Historical Society Library. I thought I would spend a couple of minutes also talking about the periodization for the presentation, because Chestnut lived from 1858 to 1932. And again, he's a native Clevelander, although he spent some formative years in the South. But in this period, beginning with 1899, this is a peak period of activity for him, certainly the first decade of the 20th century as a writer. And even through the 1920s, as his health begins to decline, he's a very well-known African-American leader at the local, state, and national levels. So again, it's in 1899 that Chestnut announces that he's going to leave his day job, let's say it that way, as a court stenographer, and become a full-time writer. And then in 1909 to 1910, he's among those individuals were engaged in organizing one of the most famous and most powerful and longstanding civil rights organizations in the country. That's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, abbreviated the NAACP. He wasn't at that first meeting in New York in 1909, although he was invited, but he was definitely there when the organization was formally organized in 1910. It was right on the same page with the leaders, Black and white, of that group. And then, of course, 1919 is important, not just because it's the end of the 19 teens, but also the end of what we would eventually call World War I or the Great War. But in the 19 teens, he was also very much involved in civic activities here in the city of Cleveland. And that escalated as we moved through the 1920s, through, the years of his declining health at the end of that decade. But the spirit, I'd have to say, of Charles Chestnut lives on in the children of Chestnut. And many of them find a home in this Jazz Age, Harlem Renaissance, new Negro movement that's associated with the 1920s, and probably the most famous former Clevelander to be active in the leadership ranks is Langston Hughes, the former student of Helen Chestnut, who graduated from Cleveland Central High School. And then, of course, for a lot of people who are in New York and trying to live as full-time writers, that renaissance is over as of the fall of 1929 with the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. But there's some good news in these bad times of the Depression. And one of the things that many Black people in Cleveland celebrated was the election in the fall of 1929 of Mary Brown Martin as the first Black person to serve on the Cleveland School Board. And she wasn't just elected, she was reelected. And she ran with a lot of Black support, but eventually came to believe that she couldn't just be the Negro member of the board. So like Chestnut, Mary Brown Martin was there fighting for the social, the political, the economic, and all citizenship rights of Black Americans, but she did it along the color line. That was very real in the lives of Black people of their time. And sometimes she worked on the Black side of the color line, sometimes on the white side, but again, trying, especially toward the end of her life in 1939, to build interracial coalition. So she's right there with Chestnut. They go to some of the same parties and social gatherings. And again, he is a race man working in tandem with race men and women. And I think that's a very important point for us to make in this introduction before we launch into the scripted portion of the presentation. Now, as I said, in 1899, we start there because that's when Chestnut makes this announcement about leaving that very lucrative position that he has as a court stenographer. This is an article that ran in the Plain Dealer on October 4th, 1899. And I'd like to read it to you because some of the words are a little hard to make out, but this is from one of the library databases that Cleveland Public Library owns. Takes up literature, Charles W. Chestnut abandons stenography for a new field. The allurements of a life devoted entirely to literary ambitions have caused Charles W. Chestnut of number 64 Brenton Street to give up the very lucrative stenographic business he has built up in Cleveland during the past 15 years. So he's been working at this since 1884 or thereabouts. The Success of the Conjure Woman, a volume of Negro dialect stories of which he is the author, led him to take this step. He blossomed into a literature at the early age of 16 years, when his first effort was accepted by one of the well-known periodicals. Since that time, he has been a frequent contributor to the best magazines. Houghton Mifflin and Company are at the present time printing his latest volume of short stories and preparing for an early edition. So that's Chestnut. And I'm guessing that some people are probably wondering why this man, who is often described as the foremost Negro writer at the turn of the 20th century, looks so much like a white man. Well, the reason is, as one of his biographers said in a 2008 publication, I'll show you the cover and give you the title at the end, Chestnut was only 1/8 Black. And the way he put it was that he's 7/8 white. And so he's kind of like Homer Plessy in that he's an octoroon, although that term wouldn't be used much in 2008, the 150th anniversary of Chestnut's birth, but he is certainly someone who is aware of his white ancestry and his Black ancestry, and he doesn't try to deny any part of his family's history, but he believes that it's through interracial cooperation, if not the amalgamation of the races, that the so-called Negro problem would be solved in the United States. His views change over time, but that's why I like to keep reading his works. He's a very fascinating individual. And yes, he looks very European, but he is definitely a Black man, according to the one drop rule that people often apply to African Americans with racially mixed ancestry. Now, in stating this thesis about Chestnut and the importance of his work, I'd like to say that as a race man, Chestnut wrote to both identify and eliminate anti-Black racism in America and its related caste system. So again, he was a Renaissance man, but he wasn't in a class by himself. He was in the good company of all of the people pictured here, whose names will be mentioned at other points in this presentation. But again, Booker T. Washington, born in slavery in what was then Virginia around 1856, went on to have a great career as a race leader and the founding principal of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Charles Chestnut, Cleveland's own, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, born just after slavery in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard, and by 1903, sort of the arch enemy of Booker T. Washington, because he didn't like Washington's conservative political views. And last but not least, Ida Bell Wells Barnett, born in slavery in Mississippi in 1862, who goes on to have a great public career. She's a radical, just like Du Bois. So, you know, they are to the left of Chestnut, but on our right, but a very interesting person. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about her later on, but I want to make this point is that there was a certain school of thought that said Black people need citizenship rights right now at the dawn of the 20th century. And again, there was a continuum from the conservative leaders like Washington to the radicals like Ida Wells Barnett, but they found common ground in suggesting that Black people are deserving of their rights now. They're not a childlike race. They are free people of color in the United States. And we need to identify this racism, call it what it is, and then eliminate that in America and the related caste system based on race, color, and class at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's why we're going to focus on Chestnut. So I have a scripted portion of this presentation, and I think it's going to work for us. I've asked Karen, in case I get carried away here with the reading, and some of the narration for the slides, to give me the high sign at about 55 minutes into the presentation, because it's my understanding that most of these programs usually last about 90 minutes. And I do want to save some time at the end to hear from the people who thought enough of what we were proposing to do this evening to join us. Okay, so I will begin with this. Again, for inspiration, keep these other members of the same or similar school of thought on the screen for just a moment. But to begin by saying this, in Chestnut's life and work, we find the threads that weave together much of the story of early 20th century leadership among African Americans in the city of Cleveland. And that's part of the language that I used in putting together a description for this evening's presentation. Chestnut was a man who excelled in benevolent and volunteer work. As a business professional, again, we said he is a court stenographer. He earned a good sum of money and shared it certainly with the members of his family and other people in the community. He was also into volunteer work, and as a business professional and as a literary artist, he won many accolades from Black and white American citizens alike. He was the father of Helen Chestnut, as I said before, a Smith College graduate, and the lone African-American teacher in the Cleveland Public Schools in 1905, a year that is important for the larger study that I did as part of my dissertation work. He was a man of means with important connections, and that helps when you're trying to make a difference in the society. And those connections were in both the Black community and the white business community and professional circles. Chestnut was Cleveland's African-American Renaissance man, and he knew it. I want to leave this slide on the screen for just a minute. As you can see, it's an image actually from the Cleveland Press collection that is now housed at the in the Special Collections Division of the Michael Schwartz Library at Cleveland State University. It's one of my favorite pictures in that collection. And certainly in a special subdivision of the collection that focuses on notable Blacks in Cleveland's history. So this is right at the start of the 20th century, and it's in Charles Chesnutt's backyard. So at this gathering, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but fourth from the left is Helen Chestnut, the daughter who taught for so many years at Central High School, and then her brother, Edwin. And again, this is in 1901. I like this picture because there are some interesting studies of elite members of the Black community, especially in the 20th century. One of the books is titled Aristocrats of Color. One of the others, much later, and that was actually, I believe, early 21st century, Our Kind of People. But it talks about people of color who also enjoyed certain privileges, usually related to their education or the amount of money that they had. Chestnut was one of those people, the aristocrats of color. And this picture for me just screams aristocracy. So I just want to leave it there for a minute as we begin to share more information about his life. Charles Chestnut, as we said before, was born in Cleveland in June of 1858, but he took the indirect route to social and educational reform in Cleveland because he believed that education and full citizenship rights went hand in hand. So before, and someone's going to question me on this, but I'm going to quote the script here. Before Tom Johnson's Cleveland's progressive era mayor succeeded in winning his first mayoral election, Chestnut had achieved success in the late 19th century, not as a civic leader, however, but as a writer, because of his honest and forthright portrayal of life along that color line that separated Blacks and whites in America, and his ability to deal with such controversial subjects as color and class prejudice among groups of people like the ones pictured here, the well-to-do colored people in Black America. So Chestnut was always very skilled at dealing with these matters related to race and color. You know, and that's true, again, of the fiction and in real life. And the many essays and articles and speeches that we have, thanks to his family, housed in various libraries across the country, we can see that that is true. Chestnut had a number of works in print, including, by the time this picture is taken, including books such as The Conjure Woman, 1899, The House Behind the Cedars in 1900, and The Wife of His Youth, and other stories of the color line. Now, again, I won't be able to spend a lot of time talking about the fictional works, but I do want to mention the names of two of my favorites that I often taught at Cleveland State, because Chestnut's short stories especially are anthologized in a lot of works, and two that deal with this idea of the color line and color prejudice within the Black community. One of them is The Wife of His Youth, which talks about the legacy of slavery and the failure of Reconstruction and the separation of Black families that took place in the antebellum period, and the fact that many of those families were not reunited even after the Reconstruction period ended in 1977. So The Wife of His Youth is an interesting story about a fair-skinned person who perhaps looked a lot like Charles Chestnut, a member of that blue vein group of colored people, very fair, so light, in fact, that they could see the blue veins, through their skin. But in any case, he was about to marry someone else in his class and color group when a very dark, not so well-to-do African-American woman with a lot of teeth missing came onto the scene. And I don't want to be the spoiler, but I'll tell you, this young man who was about to marry someone who looked like him came to understand that this Black woman who had suffered so much in her life was the wife of his youth. And this young man decides to take a stand on higher ground. So it's got a happy ending of sorts, maybe not for the beautiful young bride that he was about to marry, but certainly it's a very noble gesture on the part of this young man in the blue vein society to embrace the wife of his youth. So that's one of my favorites. The other one is Baxter's Procrustes. And I believe it is based on some of Charles Chestnut's experiences here in Cleveland as an elite member of the Black community and the first Black person to be a member of the Rofant Club here in the city of Cleveland. But it talks about a man who has a book, and the members of the club, this great literary society, believe that this book is just incredible. And they talk about the binding and they talk about the wonderful paper. And then they say everything about the book that one can say without having read the book. And to their great surprise, once they open the book, they find that the pages are all blank. I think it's a critique of maybe snobbery and elitism that was a problem, certainly among Black aristocrats of color, like some of the people mentioned here. Nothing against the aristocracy, but I think Chestnut just grew weary of the kind of pretentiousness that went hand in hand with being a member of the elite and being active in certain circles. And so he offered that sort of fictional critique, warning people, I think, in that short story that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. It's better, perhaps, to go ahead and read some of those great written works that Americans have at their disposal. So this is a home on the street that is now East 73rd Street, here in the city of Cleveland, between Cedar Avenue and Central Avenue. And again, this is where the race man is writing all of these great books that people are celebrating, Black and white, by the turn of the 20th century. So Chestnut, again, is skilled in dealing with controversy, racism, classism, colorism, snobbery, elitism, all of that in the fiction. But in real life, he chose to exercise caution before publicly supporting radical views and calls for social, political, or educational reform. Information on his early life suggests that he was well aware of the racial injustices suffered by African Americans of his day. And by early childhood, this very bookish young boy was someone who was determined that he was going to be a race leader. Most importantly, Chestnut was someone who, like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, understood the value and limitations of the self-help programs that Booker T. Washington and other Black conservatives were so fond of. As a student teacher in North Carolina, Charles Chestnut was an agent of self-help in the educational arena. So at first he was a pupil teacher, then he became a principal, but still that wasn't enough. As a young adult, he joined others in migrating out of the South. Even though he was a leader in the Black educational community, he recognized that there was more to life in America, and he sought out new opportunities outside of the South that had been so kind to him in promoting him through the educational system and making him the leader in the community where he was once a student. So he joined the great numbers of Black people migrating out of the South in the late 19th and early 20th century in search of opportunities that even the most ambitious African Americans could not attain for themselves in Southern communities. So again, he's born in Cleveland, Ohio, in this area that's north of slavery, if it's not completely free of racial prejudice and discrimination. His parents, in fact, Andrew Jackson and Anna Marie Sampson Chestnut, had migrated to the city just before the outbreak of the Civil War. And that's why he was born here in 1858. He decided again to migrate north, fleeing the oppressive conditions of the South, even for someone who looked as white as he did and knew that he was only 1/8 Black. But he really resented these restrictions that were placed upon the aspirations of even educated people in the South. He could not realize his own aspirations of becoming a highly educated African American in the South because community support and role models were sorely lacking in North Carolina. While African American folk culture eventually informed a lot of Chestnut's fiction, he did not early on find it intellectually stimulating. Even at this early stage in his life, Chestnut was already beginning to show some of the signs of the aristocratic outlook that would inform his social justice and political activism in Cleveland. There was a motto associated with the work of a lot of elite women in the Black community who found a home for their activist selves at the turn of the 20th century. And they were in the National Association of Colored Women. And their motto was lifting as we climb. And it wasn't just the colored women who believed that way. Chestnut believed that as well. Certainly he wanted to continue to climb the ladder of success. He enjoyed having a certain amount of wealth, but he did not hesitate to reach down and out to help uplift other people. After leaving North Carolina, for example, he worked first as a journalist in New York and then returned to Cleveland when he was 25 years old. So that would have been around 1883. He brought with him his wife, Susan Perry, a former teacher at the Howard School for African American students in North Carolina. And he brought a strong determination to become successful, not just for himself, but also for his family and his race. And he wrote this in one of his journals in 1878. So again, this is before the official return to Cleveland. And he said, "I will go to the North, where although the prejudice sticks like a blot on the scutcheon of American liberty, yet a man may enjoy privileges if he has the money to pay for them. I will live down the prejudice. I will crush it out. If I can exalt my race, if I can gain the applause of the good," realizing that not everybody is good, but if I can gain the applause of the good and the approbation of God, the thought of the ignorant and the prejudiced will not concern me. Close quote. Chestnut was not at all disappointed with the economic prosperity that he enjoyed here in the city of Cleveland. Again, this is just a backyard picture of the house that's on East 73rd Street, or what is now called East 73rd Street, between Cedar and Central. But those opponents, ignorance and prejudice, proved formidable for Chestnut here in the city of Cleveland. He soon secured employment, as I suggested earlier, as a stenographer while studying for the Ohio bar examination, which he passed in 1887, while he was living in the house that has the nice backyard here. And I think I'll go to the next picture because this is the library at that house at 64 Brenton, as it was described in that Plain Dealer article that we took a look at a few minutes ago. But the actual address, the house has been demolished, but the land is still there. The address was 2212 East 73rd Street. But I want to say also, in a biographical study of her father, Helen Chestnut explained the importance of the work performed by Chestnut's firm. So again, those business connections are going to be very important to him when he's working to lift Black people up, even as he continues to climb the ladder of success. So I want to go to this picture. This is the house that the Chestnuts lived in after 1904. So it looks like he's doing okay, right? So this is on the home on Lamont Avenue after 1904. So she says of the work that Chestnut is doing for the firm. The new offices in the Williamson building were adapted to stenographic work of every description. He was a specialist in taking down depositions of all sorts, as well as many other kinds of reporting. Lawyers from all over the country used his offices as their headquarters while in Cleveland. He made a lot of money. He reported testimony in court for leading corporations and admiralty lawyers. And no matter how scientific or technical the testimony was, his background in education, in law, newspaper reporting, and literature enabled him to understand it and reproduce it with absolute accuracy. So again, that's the exterior of the new house that he was able to buy in 1904. And I thought it interesting, and this is not in the script, that when Chestnut decided to quit the day job at this firm that his daughter is describing, he had two daughters in college at Smith. And so needless to say, he was confident in his abilities as a writer and understood that he had amassed a certain amount of wealth, and he believed that he would continue to prosper here in the city of Cleveland as a writer. Money from that business and the sale of his works of fiction allowed him to enjoy the privileges that he believed any hardworking man could buy. One Plain Dealer article in 1902 said, and I quote, "It is unquestionably conceded by the best literary critics of the world that the folk stories of Charles W. Chestnut have never been excelled. They are among the books most called for at the libraries." Again, end of the quote. And I think it's very interesting to note that although Chestnut was really put off by, the rough folk tales, the oral traditions circulating in the communities where the enslaved people had lived and where their descendants now lived. He wasn't really impressed by that folk literature of the South, the real deal, but it was those stories that informed the fiction that he wrote. And those dialect tales were very popular among white readers in the United States. And they helped to pay for this really nice house that he and his family lived in 1904. In the process of earning a living, Chestnut also earned the respect and admiration of others, including one Ohio historian who suggested that Chestnut was a representative of a small Black elite who lived elegantly in a style like that of wealthy whites. Members of the Chestnut family were well aware of their status in the community, and Helen Chestnut, again, the former school teacher at Central High School, took great pride in writing about the comforts of the family's home, this home in the city of Cleveland. And her description of the home and the land surrounding it included the following. This house was on a spacious lot surrounded by shrubs and trees. There was a ravine in the rear of the lot through which flowed a little brook between banks covered with wild cucumber vines and spring flowers, where birds and squirrels and little garter snakes abounded. The house itself was a beautiful place, designed by one of Cleveland's leading architects, built of the finest materials with hardwood floors, downstairs and plate glass windows throughout. The family moved into this house on Lamont Avenue in May of 1904 and lived there during the remainder of Charles Chesnutt's life, which, as I said, ended in 1932, and for several years thereafter. So again, beautiful house. And there are several pictures of the house, the backyard, the flowers and the roses on the trellis, all of that in the Cleveland Public Library collection that's available online. And again, this picture is part of that collection. I also want to go here because this is an image of Chestnut in the library of that new home circa 1905. Although pleased with his own success, he was also keenly aware that money could not purchase a complete escape from racial discrimination. And so Chestnut was somewhat concerned when he listened to the conciliatory speeches of Booker T. Washington, the acknowledged leader of the Black community. And all of this is happening in the 1890s, soon after Washington outlines his plan for African-American self-help in his Atlanta Exposition speech, delivered in Atlanta, Georgia in the fall of 1895, and also included in Washington's most famous book, Up from Slavery. He says to Black people, cast down your buckets where you are. Cast them down in industry and the professions and try to become friends with, cultivate friendly relations with people of all races by whom we are surrounded, okay? You can't escape by going to the North. You can't escape by going back to Africa. You gotta stay here in the South, where a Negro is given a man's chance, right, to get a job in industry. So some people dismiss that as the gospel of work and money, but it was a popular message, sometimes even popular with Charles Chestnut, who was a hardworking, money-making man. But he didn't want to stop there. He also wanted to enjoy other rights and privileges that he believed would be associated with full citizenship for African Americans. So again, watching from the sidelines sometimes when Booker T. Washington is saying these things at the turn of the 20th century. In time, however, Chestnut and Washington became close friends, and Chestnut visited Washington's home in 1901 when he had, and I quote, for the first time realized the greatness of the work that was being done at Tuskegee. And again, that's Tuskegee Industrial and Normal Institute, historically Black college for which Washington was the founding principal, and that's in Alabama. And so again, he realizes they're doing great work in training people for jobs in emerging industries and also training teachers, Black teachers who can teach in Black schools where illiteracy was still a major problem in America among Black people in the South, even in the first decade of the 20th century. And this is 2 generations beyond slavery. So again, they became friends. Chestnut was not alone in his admiration for Washington. The Wizard of Tuskegee continued to preach this gospel of work and money and industrial education to a captive audience. But it was a little frustrating for people who aspire to do something besides be farmers and teachers and preachers and brick masons and other kinds of manual laborers in the American South. Some of them aspired to be men of letters, just like Charles W. Chesnutt. So again, Chestnut was a little frustrated sometimes by the things that Washington said and did. So their friendship began to show signs of strain, especially when some African Americans became more vocal in their calls for full citizenship. And some of those African Americans, we're talking about the group that includes W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells Barnett. The strain was clearly evident in private correspondence between Chestnut and Booker T. Washington. And again, both of them have extensive letters that have been collected and edited in libraries now in the United States. And much of that material is now available online. But Chestnut wrote in June of 1903 to Booker T. Washington, "I appreciate all you say and have written about industrial education and property, but they are not everything. There is no good reason why we should not acquire them and exercise our constitutional rights at the same time, and acquire them all the more readily because of our equality of rights. I have no confidence in that friendship of the whites, which is to take the place of rights. No expectation of justice at their hands unless it is founded on law." So, white friends are okay, but if they deny equality of opportunity according to the law, then Charles Chestnut's going to have a problem with them. By May 1904, Chestnut was delivering the same message in his public speeches. One of those speeches, called the Elements of Citizenship, he delivered before an audience in Washington, D.C. that had 700 people in the lecture hall. And that was reported in the Cleveland Gazette. He went so far as to say that leadership of the race ought to be preeminently political in character. So he was certainly opposed to all efforts to disfranchise Blacks in the American South. The presence of the strained relationship between Washington and Chestnut, however, did not mean that they couldn't work together, and they often did. One of the groups that both men supported was the Committee of 12 for the Advancement of the Negro. Chestnut joined that organization in 1905 when W.E.B. Du Bois left because there was too many conservatives like Washington in the group for his taste. When he left, he founded an organization, Du Bois did, called the Naacp Movement. It was an all African-American male organization at the beginning. And there were a number of things that they focused on in their struggle for full citizenship rights, including an unfettered press, manhood, suffrage, the abolition of all caste distinctions based simply on race and color, the recognition of the principle of human brotherhood as a practical present creed, the recognition of the highest and best training as the monopoly of no class or race, a belief in the dignity of labor, and united effort to realize these ideals. These are all things that Du Bois and his African-American colleagues in the Naacp movement are in favor of. And this movement also stressed the importance of education. And it stated in its original platform, common school education should be free to all American children and compulsory. And further, high school education should be free to all American children and provided for all. Chestnut watched the activities of this all-Black Naacp movement from a distance while serving on the Committee of 12 with Booker T. Washington. But to his credit, Chestnut did join forces with some of the leaders of the Naacp movement at a later date. And this capacity to see the best, if you will, or to focus on the good, on people who could be as conservative and as conciliatory as Booker T. Washington was a strength, I believe. That's evident in the character of Charles Waddell Chesnutt. The activities of the Committee of 12 usually involve little more than attending meetings, circulating articles, and making speeches, presenting African Americans in a positive light. And that wasn't quite enough for Chestnut. Chestnut said, for example, in response to a speech given by Booker T. Washington, you argue the question, this is the question of the Negro and the rights that he should enjoy. You argue the question, this is from a 1908 letter, as though the Negro must choose between voting and eating. He ought to do both and can do both better together than either alone. It is not the act of voting I speak of, it is the right of every citizen to have some part in the choice of those who rule him. And the only way he can do it under our system is through the ballot. Close quote. Chestnut would not bow to those forces that encourage conciliation, to matters that he thought essential to African-American progress, not just here in Cleveland, but also throughout the nation. Because again, he's a nationally published author and essayist at this point in his career. This is 1908. And so there are people all over the country who are reading his works and agreeing with him sometimes. One of his most important and influential fans in the women's club movement and also in the suffragists, and as a suffragist, as Carrie Williams Clifford. I'm sorry, I almost lost my place in my script, but she said to Chestnut in a letter, "Now you must admit with me, in the light of your statement that duties are the offspring of rights, so Black people don't have a duty to obey unjust laws if they don't have the right to participate in the making of those laws. So duties are the offspring of rights. How very foolish any such teaching as the foregoing is, that is the teaching of Booker T. Washington, and not in any sense wise, though I suspect it may be humble enough." And in such points as these, it is that thinking Negroes must take issue with Dr. Washington. So again, Chestnut, one of those thinking Negroes, Carrie Clifford, one of those thinking Negroes. Chestnut's response was really interesting. And he said, again, cautiously, and emphasizing that there is an effectiveness associated with a certain philosophical point of view, and also, and these are his words, hysterical declamation. So, you know, the radicals are always declaring certain things, you know, and sometimes they're very hysterical. And if you're Ida B. Wells, you're saying it in a loud voice or writing it in a very powerful way in the column that she has, signing the pen name Iola. And this column is reproduced throughout the country in Black newspapers. But again, stating that we need both of these, right? We need the philosophical point of view, the cool-headed people, and we need to be able to try to reason with people and be hysterical when it's necessary. We need both groups, some to fan the flame and others to fuel the fire, according to Chestnut. But despite this cautionary note sounded here, it's clear that Chestnut and other moderates were moving in a different direction that would allow them to embrace a radical agenda. And that happened between 1908 and 1910, when the NAACP was formally organized. And again, the NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But it should be noted that radical whites played an important role in pulling the group together in New York and keeping them focused. In fact, it's also worth noting that every member of that charter board, governing board for the national body, everybody except Du Bois was white. And Du Bois was hired, I like to call him the minister of propaganda, but he served as the chair of publicity. And he was a longtime editor of the NAACP's Crisis magazine, which published a lot of literary pieces by aspiring writers, including Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston during the Harlem Renaissance. So one thing is important about the NAACP, certainly is a civil rights organization. And civil rights, I like to think of as those social rights exercised by Americans that are given the protection of law. So codified, for example, in the language of the Constitution, in the Citizenship Amendment to the Constitution that's ratified in 1868. And that clause, that refers to the equal protection of the laws in that 14th Amendment, becomes the foundation of the modern civil rights movement, which Du Bois and Chestnut will certainly be actively involved in. Okay, and they link, again, these NAACP activists, education with the enjoyment of full citizenship in the United States. In 1910, again, the year in which the NAACP comes together as a formal organization, Chestnut was invited to address supporters of what was called the National Negro Committee. The title of his speech, "The Effect of Disfranchisement in the Courts," suggests his ongoing concern with the connection between the civil and political rights for African Americans. At that May 1910 gathering, the NAACP was incorporated, and as I said, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the charter members, along with Ida Bell Wells Barnett, active suffragist, but Du Bois is the one who got the position on the board when it was formed in 1910. Other members from the all-Black Niagara movement that Du Bois had organized in 1905 also joined the ranks of the interracial NAACP, and several served on the national board by 1914. The founding principles of the NAACP suggest that educational reform was a high priority on their list of activities, and that the primary means by which this civil rights organization would achieve its goals include education, organization, agitation, and publicity. And Du Bois was very good about promoting the radical agenda of the NAACP in that Crisis magazine. Although Charles W. Chesnutt had earlier been reluctant to ally himself with the members of the radical Niagara movement, he was well aware of and had great respect for Du Bois' work on behalf of the race. And he also acknowledged the distressing power imbalance in America when we focused on the condition or the plight of Blacks and whites in the society. And he said this in his correspondence with Du Bois: "What the Negro needs more than anything else is a medium through which he can present his case to thinking white people, who after all are the arbiters of our destiny. How helpless the Negro is in the South, your own writings give ample proof. While in the North, he is so vastly in the minority in numbers, to say nothing of his average humble condition, that his influence alone would be inconsiderable." So Black people can't do this by themselves. If we go even to the progressive era of Tom Johnson, mayor of the city of Cleveland, when he was elected mayor, Black people in Cleveland were less than 2% of the population. 75% of the population, however, in census year 1910, were either foreign born or had one parent who was born in a foreign country. So again, white ethnics in the city of Cleveland, thinking whites in any part of the community, thinking whites in any part of the country, Black people needed to form alliances with those people if they wanted to lift themselves up out of this degraded state that they found themselves in. Certainly in Jim Crow America, in the North and the South, they needed the support of white people. The NAACP allowed for the creation of a formal organization that had money, the backing of very well-to-do, progressive, some people would say radical white people, to fight the good fight on behalf of full citizenship rights for all people, regardless of race. And so for the foreseeable future, 1910, when the NAACP comes together, Du Bois and Chestnut agree. The struggle for African-American liberation was going to be an interracial affair.
Regina, just because you asked me to, it is just
Yeah.
about 8 o'clock. We're coming up on 8 o'clock.
Okay, great. And we're coming to the end of the scripted portion, and I want to focus on the future because, as I said, the activism that Charles Chestnut begins to engage in a very concerted fashion, especially after 1915, after the death of Booker T. Washington and his growing involvement in the NAACP and what would eventually be the Urban League here in Greater Cleveland, focused on the needs, especially of the young people in the society. Again, by the time Chestnut gets the Spingarn Medal from the NAACP in 1928, he's 70 years old, but his children can benefit and their children can benefit from his ongoing involvement in civil rights activities. So again, the NAACP is especially concerned, as is the Urban League, with the plight of Black people in the rural South. Certainly, that's where most of them remain, despite this great Black migration that escalates in the interwar period between 1920 and 1941. But Chestnut is there, and not just in those organizations with a Black focus, he's also on the board of the Karamu House, the Playhouse Settlement initially, but working with progressive thinkers like Mary Brown Martin, serving on the board of Karamu House and supporting the interracial artistic activism of the idealistic founders and longtime leaders of Karamu House, Russell and Rowena Jelliff. So using this idea of the socialization of Negro through the arts as part of this larger program for, I think it's fair to say, mainstreaming Black Americans and making sure that they understand that there is a place for them in the room, at the table where decisions are being made, whether there's a political space or a place like Karamu House, this place of joyful gathering, which focuses on the theater arts. And again, the Chestnut children, I should say, the picture with the 3 children, Ethel, Edwin, and Helen, that's taken in the 1880s. Dorothy is born in 1890. So by the time Chestnut is a leader in NAACP activities in Cleveland, they're all grown up. And by the 19-teens, Helen, who is the middle daughter here in this picture, she is a teacher at Central High School where Langston Hughes is a student. Charles Chestnut was always one of those local citizens who fought for the rights of Black teachers and Black students in the public schools. And interestingly enough, there's an interesting story that's told in the autobiographical work of Frank Spalding, who was a school superintendent. But he talks about a meeting that he had with Chestnut, where Chestnut insisted that students should be assigned to their schools and teachers should be assigned to students without regard to race. And again, this is 1917, and Superintendent Spalding quickly dismissed all that. He couldn't understand why a Negro would even care, what was happening, a Negro writer, a celebrated writer, why he would care what was happening to Black teachers. Well, obviously, Superintendent Spalding didn't know that one of those Black teachers was his daughter, Helen, who was very well known in the city and certainly loved, dearly beloved by her students at Central High School. So again, we're on the eve of the entry of the United States into the Great War in 1917, when Chestnut is continuing to fight the good fight on behalf of Black American citizens. But I want to end my formal discussion of the material here by reminding you that there's a lot of material related to Chestnut's life and legacy housed at the Western Reserve Historical Society in the research library, which is, and research in the library is available right now by appointment only, but you can try to see if you can get an appointment if you'd like to look at some of those materials in the Chestnut collection. And I would encourage you to take a look at this report that's titled the migration, I'm sorry, it's a report on Negro migration. Now it's undated, but it focuses on the plight of Black Clevelanders in the 1920s. Very interesting in the way that he talks about the ongoing Negro migration to cities like Cleveland and Detroit, and the fact that although Black people are migrating north to escape that degraded state that they found themselves in the South, they're often living in poverty areas in the city of Cleveland, despite the fact that it has this history of being progressive on some matters. But again, the NAACP is there, the Negro Welfare Group, which eventually became the Urban League. All of that's there. All of that you can read about in Chestnut's papers at the Historical Society, as well as his involvement in and support for the Karamu House. The papers of people like Mary B. Martin are also available at the Historical Society. And again, the collection is especially rich in material for the 1920s. These are the declining years for Charles W. Chesnutt. This is Chestnut with this group of Spingarn medalist supporters, I'd have to call him. His wife is there too, right next to him here. This is Chestnut. And again, he is 70 years old in 1928 and has experienced a number of medical problems, but he is still recognized for his greatness as a writer, although his peak years were at the turn of the 20th century. And so I will say then, in wrapping up this presentation, that I agree with Oxford's definition of civics as a study of the rights and duties of citizenship. And therefore, I remain convinced that no civics history related to Blacks in the city of Cleveland would be complete without the story of Charles Waddell Chesnutt and his activism, especially in the NAACP and other groups that worked on behalf of African Americans in the early decades of the 20th century. So again, I want to conclude with just a few remarks about the remaining slides. This is a picture of that house on Lamont. That house has also been razed. You can read about the history, however, on the website for the Cleveland Restoration Society. There's a school that was built, I believe is the Orr School, was built on the site, but there was historic landmark sign that was placed there by the state of Ohio, recognizing the contributions of Charles Chesnutt to American history and culture and American arts and letters, and certainly to the history of Black Cleveland. This is a picture of Helen. She's the one who's kneeling here. She's the one who taught at Central High School with Mrs. Chestnut pre-1936. That's when they moved out of the house. And again, the house is torn down soon after that. This is Miss Helen Chestnut as she appeared in 1958 at Cleveland Public Library, that's CPL, standing by a display devoted to her father, Charles Waddell Chesnutt. And most of the images that you see in that case are the ones that are in that digital collection that Miss Chestnut donated to the library. She passed away in 1969, but the materials were acquired by the library in 1970. So I'm assuming that she named them as the beneficiaries in her will. And in conclusion, Chestnut, and this is a picture of him in 1928 as well, when he was 70 years old. Chestnut had quite a legacy that I think we can all be proud of, those of us who are native Clevelanders or just Clevelanders because we work here or because we like to study the history of Cleveland. But certainly Langston Hughes, this leading light of the Harlem Renaissance, was one of those individuals in the 1920s who continued to pay homage not only to Charles W. Chesnutt for his great literary achievements and his civil rights activism and his work along the color line, but also to an earlier Ohio writer Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was a native of Dayton, Ohio. And as far as the work of the NAACP is concerned, I certainly want to acknowledge the legacy of L. Pearl Mitchell, who was born in the 19th century but lived till 1974, and for a time was the president of the NAACP and was as radical as Du Bois and Chestnut, and certainly a civic leader and a civic activist in her own right. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll stop talking now. Put this on the screen for further reading if you're interested in that. Lots of published works in our libraries by Chestnut. And also there's a wonderful Charles Chesnutt Digital Archive that just got a sizable grant for the humanities, right? $152,000, more than $152,000 for the Charles Chesnutt Digital Archive to support the publication of the complete correspondence of Charles W. Chestnut. Dr. Karen Lawrence said that she would share the link to this digital archive if you're interested in doing further reading of the letters, the correspondence, the speeches, the journals, the fictional works. You can find some of all of that on this website maintained by the University of Nevada, Lincoln at chestnutarchive.org. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll stop the screen share right now. And if you have questions for me,
There are so many questions.
Oh, so many questions. Okay. Let me see.
This was amazing. Thank you. It's just, I always just the interconnections and the debates that all these just geniuses were having is, I find that so fascinating how they were all the letters to, I'm babbling. So question is from Ellen, and she was wondering about Chestnut's wife. Who is she and what was her background?
Oh, well, Mrs. Chestnut was a teacher also at the Howard School in North Carolina. And the Howard School is an institution, and I think I can do this without the script and still be correct, even though I haven't memorized all this. But the Howard School is one of those institutions founded by the Freedmen's Bureau in the wake of the Civil War. So that's during the Reconstruction period. The Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands enjoyed some of its greatest success in planting these schools to educate the children of the formerly enslaved Black Americans. And a lot of those people were very fair-skinned and very privileged, not all of them, but significant numbers of them who came, many of them from the North to the South to teach because they understood that that they had more education probably than a lot of those adults who attended those schools would ever secure in their lifetimes. And so they went to the South. Ida B. Wells Barnett was one of the formerly enslaved people who benefited from their generosity in the classroom. And Mrs. Chestnut, to answer the question, was a teacher at the Howard School where Charles Chestnut was also a pupil teacher, and then eventually became one of the administrators. And so they married, stayed for a while in the South, but eventually in their 20s, they're gonna move back to the city of Cleveland. Thank you for your question.
Josephine asked, did all of the members of the Chestnut family identify as Black?
Yes, they did. Oh, wait a minute. Let me qualify that. Now, are we talking about the people who are in the pictures here? Because all of the ones in the pictures here, yes, identified as being Negro people. Now, the whole family, the extended family, there were a lot of white people in Charles Chestnut's family because, again, he's only 1/8 Black. So. Yeah.
But his children, I think, especially.
Yes, his children certainly did. And thank you for the question. It's a very important one because they and Charles Chestnut could have passed for white, but they did not. Not based on the reading that I've done. Now, let me say I haven't read everything, But with this digital humanities project, there's a whole lot more reading that I intend to do. I'm kind of like Grace Mims in that regard. She didn't publish that master's thesis on Charles Chestnut that she wrote for the School of Library Science at Case. And I haven't published that chapter from my dissertation that dealt with Chestnut's legacy here in the city of Cleveland. And I think I'd like to publish that. So yeah,
Good,
more reading for Regina. More questions?
Who was the audience for Chestnut's writing? Was it multiracial or mostly Black or mostly white?
Well, you know what, at the turn of the 20th century, thank you for that question. It's mostly white. And the stories that are very popular, again, are those dialect tales. Now, he's not the first one to do that, you know, like the Gooford Grapevine and some of the more popular African-American fictionalized folk tales. He talks about having problems with the superstition and the ignorance among the unlettered Black people of the South. You know, he just couldn't relate to that. He was an educator. You know, he wanted to enlighten them and move them away from that stuff. But that's what informed his fiction. And those dialect tales were very popular with white readers at the turn of the 20th century. Someone else who did very well with the dialect tales is another one of those mentors for Langston Hughes. Paul Laurence Dunbar died in 1906, but his dialect poetry and his fictionalized works, they're also written in that way. So white people love them. You know, there's an uncle usually, you know, telling the story. If you think about Uncle Remus, right? Yeah. You know, so there's a Black elderly man that's often telling these tales to a child, but again, they're very popular. And if you can just imagine some of the dialect verse, like that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote around the same time. One of the anthologies is Little Brown Baby, and I love his poetry. I borrowed this book when my oldest son was born 42 years ago, right? But Little Brown Baby with sparkling eyes, come to your pappy, sit on his knee. So some of the poems are really loving, you know, what you been doing, sir? You know, it sort of tries to capture Black vernacular speech. But Toni Morrison was bothered by stuff like that because she said you can always tell when the Black people are talking in those kinds of books because all the words are misspelled. So you know, it's hard to capture the feel of Black vernacular speech in those misspelled words. But those stories and the poetry written by Paul Laurence Dunbar, they're very popular with white readers, and they have the money to buy the books. They're not unpopular with Black people, but most of his audience, they're mostly white people.
Another question, how did Cleveland race relations during Chestnut's time compare with other similar sized cities like St. Louis, Cincinnati, Baltimore?
Oh, thank you for that question. This is a perfect setup. I need the glasses because this is in print. It's very small. It must be like 9 points, but it's in a book. Some of the stuff from the dissertation inspired me to publish chapters. And one of them is in this book, Education and the Great Depression. So again, this is 1920s and 30s, Chestnut's time. But here's a quote that I like, and it is so wrong, but it's by one of my favorite writers, W.E.B. Du Bois, right? One of my favorite snobs, you know, with the Harvard PhD. I love him. But in my chapter, right, this is what helped me get tenure at Cleveland State. So in my chapter, my peer-reviewed scholarly publication, thank you, Dr. Lawrence. I know why you're smiling. Reading, Writing, and Racial Uplift, Education and Reform in Cleveland, Ohio. Du Bois wrote this in 1924. So this is how I start the chapter. In Northern Ohio, there is the city of Cleveland. For 50 years, the colored group in Cleveland has fought for municipal recognition and equality, and it has accomplished a splendid work. So to answer your question, Du Bois says, and he doesn't live in Cleveland, but he thinks by 1904, Black people in Cleveland are doing okay. They've accomplished a splendid work. Our great colored author, Charles W. Chesnutt, is a member of the leading literary and social clubs, including the Rofamp Club. A colored lawyer, Harry Davis, is a member of the Cleveland City Club. and long has served in the Ohio legislature. We have colored councilmen. We have colored teachers in the public schools who teach without segregation or discrimination. Obviously, he had not spoken with Charles Chestnut, right? But he's writing this, probably in New York or Atlanta in 1924. But he says there is not a single Jim Crow institution in the city. And this is because with 50 years fighting, we have achieved real democracy in Cleveland. So again, the Black population is very small. And it's growing, incrementally because of the Great Migration. But even by 1967, when Carl Stokes is elected mayor the first time around, Blacks are about a third of the population. So the population is very small, and they're concentrated on the east side, especially in the greater central Cedar area where Chestnut is living initially on East 73rd, all around in there. That's that Negro ghetto that Kenneth Kustner wrote so eloquently about. And I keep mentioning his name because I thought it was just really a definitive history of Blacks in Cleveland, late 19th through at least the first 3 decades of the 20th century. That's a book you want to look at if you really
What was the name of that book again?
A Ghetto Takes Shape. And the author is Kenneth, some people pronounce his name Kuzmer, Kusmer. He published that book in the 1970s. It is incredible. And I think it's one of his greatest works, but he passed away just last year. But I know that there are people who are still teaching that book in the city of Cleveland in urban affairs and also in history courses. But thank you so much for your question.
Yeah. Do you think that Chestnut believed in the American dream?
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of like the American dream that every little boy can be president, or every little white boy can be president maybe in his lifetime through the 1930s. I believe that he believed in the promise of America, and especially the promise of citizenship. And that's why he fought so hard. Chestnut was an elder in the 1920s. He didn't have to prove anything to anybody. His daughters were doing okay. They graduated from Smith. They had the nice house. They went to the best social affairs. He didn't have to serve on any of those boards. He was not one of those Negro migrants from the South who didn't realize that you shouldn't be on the front porch of your house wearing an apron or a bandana on your head. So there was some class prejudice there. We really have to uplift these people because America is a great and glorious place. And so in mainstreaming them, and I'm not judging Chestnut harshly, although one of his biographers says he was most comfortable around the upper class, multiracial group of people who were like him, sort of like the author of that book says in the title, Our Kind of People. He was most comfortable. I don't know how that particular scholar reached that conclusion. I think he was comfortable working with people at whatever station they found themselves at. Caramel House, that's definitely Black theater. The Urban League, that's definitely an organization that's focusing on the economic empowerment of Black people who were the lowest down, on the ladder of economic success. I don't think he would say that they were low lives, but they need a lot of help. And yes, I believe that he believed in the promise of the American dream that, you could go west or go wherever you needed to go and find a better life for yourself if you had the tools to do that. And you need your education, and you need your citizenship rights, and you need some money. You need your economic rights. You need to be able to work at whatever task your education prepares you for. If you have a PhD from Harvard, why can't you have a tenured position? Where do we want to go? At the University of Chicago, W.E.B. Du Bois, he never had a full-time tenure position anywhere. But because he fought the good fight with Charles Chesnutt, Regennia earned tenure at Cleveland State. So yes, I think Charles Chestnut believed in the American dream, and I think he would be proud that I became the first Black woman in the history of Cleveland State to earn tenure in the history department. Thank you for your questions. I love this.
This was a great comment. I thought that it's not a question, but that several of us are from Seattle area and are currently reading Cedars for a study group. And they
like the house behind the Cedar, that one, good for you. The whole book. See, that's the danger of using the Norton Anthology of African-American Literature for years. It's a huge, it's thick. It's like thicker than the telephone books used to be for New York, over 1,000 pages. But they pull snippets from Chestnut's greatest works, just so the students, can have, just get a feel for, what the writing was like at the turn of the 20th century. And it's really beautiful. I think his essays, get the purple prose in there. It's all good. And I like, the dialect stuff as well, but you never get the whole book, in those anthologies. You just get a few pages. So good for you, friends in Seattle, for reading about the foremost Negro author in one of his greatest books, Charles Waddell Chesnutt, native Clevelander.
Let's see, a couple of questions about the Niagara movement. Did the Niagara movement disband when the NAACP was formed? And how did it get its name? Did it have anything to do with its location near Canada or migration to Canada?
Yes, there's interesting stories. Here's one thing. All Black men in that initial group, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and they're radicals. One story says they couldn't get hotel rooms and meeting space on the American side of the Niagara Falls. So they ended up going to Canada, where things were a little bit more hospitable. But it's also an all-male group. So it took a while for Carrie Clifford, to get to the point where she could be among the leaders of the Niagara movement. It didn't disband immediately. So the NAACP is not a regrouping of the Niagara movement, that nationalistic kind of civil rights organization. But there are a lot of Niagara movement alums who find a home like Du Bois in the NAACP a few years down the road. But but the NAACP is not an outgrowth of that all Black organization. And it didn't die right away. But yeah.
Okay, Chestnut had his feet in both Black and white worlds during this time. Were there other African Americans in Cleveland who were able to do the same thing?
Oh, sure. I would argue for a time that L. Pearl Mitchell, the Black woman on one of the last slides, who I said eventually became a president of the NAACP here in Cleveland. Well, she was born in Wilberforce, Ohio, and she was the daughter of a college president. So, and she was a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. It's a very big deal. It's the first Black sorority founded on the campus of Howard University before my incredible sorority, before Delta Sigma Theta sorority. We had Alpha Kappa Alpha. And that, of course, is a sorority that Kamala Harris pledged when she was a student at Howard. So again, I would argue that L. Pearl Mitchell was one of those people. She became, she was a social worker, educator type by training. She became a probation officer in the city of Cleveland. So it's not necessarily one of those teach, preach, or farm, categories, or teach in a Black school or a majority Black school, which Central High School was becoming in the 19-teens, and eventually became a majority Black school soon after. Langston Hughes graduated. It wasn't like that when Mary Brown Martin was class vocalist, but it became that way by the time she was on the school board. So again, there was a segregationist tendency in the city of Cleveland, but Chestnut and L. Pearl Mitchell were among those people who could cross the color line and do things in a rather non-traditional way. But they were very militant, I think it's fair to say, in their insistence that Black people should enjoy all the civil rights of every other citizen of this country. So yeah, I put L. Pearl Mitchell there. Let me see, other Black people. Okay, let's go with eventually, although she's a little younger than Chestnut, how about Zelma Watson George, right? An alternate to the UN, delegate alternate to the UN. Her papers are at the Historical Society too, but she was a great lady, great educator, sociologist. Yeah, I know there's an oral history interview because she was part of the Black Women's Oral History Project, and I believe Harvard University put together, and that oral history is available online, but I think the bound oral history transcript of Zelma Watson George talking about her life in the city of Cleveland is available at the Western Reserve Historical Society. Haven't been in the stacks in a while. Again, gotta make an appointment. But the other thing I want to say about Zelma George, she's got this doctorate in sociology, but she also focuses on Black culture, especially Black sacred music in the form of the spiritual. And also her husband, Claiborne George, was a successful attorney and very active in Republican politics. And he's not as fair as Zelma. So it's not just the fair-skinned Black people who can cross the color line when they have to in order to get things done, but people like Claiborne George and Zelma George and L. Pearl Mitchell are also there fighting for the rights of all people on both sides of the color line.
What would Chestnut have thought of John Hawley's "Don't Shop Where You Can't Work" movement, which came very soon after Chestnut's death?
Yeah, well, you know what? I think it makes sense, because, and it's hard to predict what he would have said, because by the time, you're 78 and just kind of chilling with the grandkids, and your daughter is getting your papers in order because someday she's going to write this great book about you. Maybe he would have been a little more moderate, but perhaps from that rocking chair on the back porch and that beautiful house right on Lamont, maybe he would have said, "Good for the Future Outlook League." And John O'Holly's information on the Future Outlook League, also at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And I don't think Chestnut would have been out there, marching, and protesting with those big signs. And that was part of a national movement. Don't buy where you can't work. But insist that people treat you with respect and act respectable if you want that kind of treatment. I think that would be Chestnut's way of saying, this is how you get respect. This is how you're going to get a job at the telephone company. We're going to have the protest on the left, the activism, right? And we're going to have some people who are willing to negotiate and discuss the matter, right? But we're not going to have laws that enforce discriminatory practices. Yeah.
Let's see, was Chestnut a Republican, and was that unusual at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Everything that I see suggests that he was certainly a Republican. There is a book, I can't think of the author's name right now, but Farewell Party of Lincoln. And it talks about the Black exodus from the Republican Party that begins in earnest during the years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's terms as president. He was elected a record 4 times. And then we fixed the Constitution, so that wouldn't happen again. But Roosevelt, because of the way that he responded to the calls for assistance, for help, for relief and reform and recovery during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it didn't end with World War II. Some people were still struggling. But the U.S. entry into the war after 1941 certainly helped to create a lot of jobs and put a lot of people back to work. But Roosevelt was there, again, as a Democrat from New York. Not quite the same as that Democratic Party in the South, but he's still a Democrat. And most Black people in Charles Chesnutt's lifetime, if they were voting in their best interest, they were voting for Republican candidates. And that included Mary Brown Martin. That included her husband, attorney Alexander Martin. That included their children, Sarah and Alexander, all of them, you know. And there were some people tell me, even the members of the Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. family in the 1950s who were Republicans and continue to believe up to a certain point that the best people in Black America voted for Republicans. But we start to see a few more going into that Democratic Party in the era of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, because he says some things, you know, related to civil rights, you know, and says some things about the civil rights activists, you know, especially the peaceful protesters in Dr. King's camp, to suggest that he's in favor of a civil rights bill and ultimately a civil rights act. Unfortunately, John Fitzgerald Kennedy assassinated in November 1963 before a significant civil rights bill was signed into law. But yeah, most of them, that was the question. Most of the smart, politically engaged Black people were voting for Republicans in Chestnut's lifetime. And for many of them, a long time after that, including, and I don't think he would mind me saying this, Virgil Brown Sr., right? Who served, you know, it wasn't called the county council then, but the, what do we call that group before we got, before Jimmy DeMora and some of the others, you know, suggested that there was a time for change. But yeah, Virgil Brown Sr., great Republican. And who else? I have to think, there aren't a whole lot that I'm aware of. In the 20th century, I apologize, the late, great Purnell Jones, a great funeral home owner and director, great businessman, the late, great Purnell Jones, US veteran and musician with some history in the South, a well-known Republican, but his son, right, Purnell Jones Jr., who's on the county council, is a Democrat. So again, we have Black people sometimes in the same family who are Democrats and Republicans, but it took Black folks a long time to get out of the party of Lincoln and get into the party of Roosevelt, okay, which wasn't necessarily pro-Black when Roosevelt was president.
It is 8:35. Do you have time for another couple of questions, or?
Yeah, I can take one or two and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. How about, there was a movement to create separate Black institutions, which flew in the face of the integrationists. How did Chestnut handle this change in the 1920s as things started to get worse for Blacks in Cleveland?
Yeah, that movement for the creation of Black institutions is something that predates the Civil War. So there are historically Black colleges before the Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations in Reconstruction began to encourage that kind of thing. So we get Howard University and Fisk University and lots of other historically Black colleges. By the early 20th century, there are about 100 of them. Fewer now because they were smaller and there were lots of mergers. And then Black people were being accepted into majority white institutions, especially after the Brown v. Board decision and the civil rights activism of the 1950s. The historically Black institutions, I think, continue to play a significant role in educating Black people in the United States. And I'm so proud. I left Cleveland State in 2015. I moved to the Metro DC area, hoping to get, I think I told Dr. Karen Lawrence's story, that job at the Smithsonian, because the National Museum of African American History and Culture was about to open. Well, there are a lot of people trying to get jobs at the Smithsonian, especially that museum. But I did get a job teaching at the University of the District of Columbia. And that came about, the creation of that institution, following the merger of several institutions that serve Black students, including a teacher's college, that prepared Black teachers in the DC area. And so historically Black institutions like UDC, the community college where I taught, that was a historically Black institution, not exclusively, but historically. And that came into being on the watch of Mayor Marion Barry. But Howard University, Fisk in Nashville, Tennessee, Wilberforce, Central State, which is now a publicly supported institution here in Ohio, has a history of being Black serving. So there was a divide, to answer your question. Not everybody could send their daughters to Smith, like Chestnut. Not everybody had daughters that looked like Chestnut's daughter, who could really negotiate life along the color line and be comfortable around white people in an otherwise all white setting except for them. And they could pass if they needed to, in order to be safe when they were in college. Not everybody had that option. So I still think, again, for veterinary medicine, there are, especially when we think about what Tuskegee is doing in training engineers and other sciences, preparing people, in Meharry trained a lot of Black doctors. Those institutions beyond Chestnut's lifetime will continue to play an important role. Now people have choices. They can go to a historically Black college and they'll see white people on the campus. I saw a lot of that when I was in the Metro DC area. It's still a historically Black college, and all the traditions with the fraternities and the sororities, that's still part of the history. But they do not exclude white people. And there are lots of Black people from the African diaspora, from the Caribbean. When I was there, the president was Afro-Caribbean and he was trained as a scientist. So again, and there are lots of faculty members who are white. I think we should have both, because I think there's an excellent research library at Howard University, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. In the library system for Howard University, the law library is there as well as the Founders Library. But Moreland Spingarn, that same Spingarn that's associated with that medal that Charles Chesnutt got for his great literary achievements in 1928, that money helped to put that research center in place. And so when you go there, because Black people didn't always have the option of going to other colleges. Don't ask me how Du Bois and Chestnut worked that Harvard-Smith connection, but most people didn't have that option. So we needed Moreland Spingarn, we needed Founders Library, we needed historically Black colleges and universities. And now I think we need those different options, that people can just look at the whole higher education landscape and decide, this is where I want to go. This is where I want to go I want to go over here as a student. I want to go over there to Howard University, to Moreland Spingarn to finish my research. I want to go to Fisk because I know they have papers of Charles Chestnut. And until they finish digitizing all of these letters and other written works, I need to go to Fisk and sit in that library and work with those manuscript collections. So again, it's hard. After 1954, when the Supreme Court has says those distinctions based on race really have no basis in law, and their violation of the forced segregation are a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, they're unconstitutional. For even now, for historically Black colleges to say white people stay away. No, you can't do that. It's a violation of the promise of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, white people can go there knowing that all that Black history and all that Black culture is there, but you cannot discriminate against them because they are white on the campuses of historically Black colleges. That's how the law is supposed to work. So it's hard, it's a struggle. But again, I think for Chestnut, the struggle was for the option, to have the choice. If I want to go to Harvard, don't tell me that I have to go to Howard. Right. Because the libraries at Harvard have more funding and more books, more volumes, you can get more done on that campus in the 1930s than you can at Howard University. Nothing against Black schools. I need that library, okay? If I'm gonna earn this PhD and be prepared to teach once I get that terminal degree. So yeah, it's a struggle, but I'm glad that we have both the Black stream institutions and the mainstream institutions, if I can do that, and that people of all races have choices. There are Asian, Indian, Hindu people who attend school on the campus of Howard University. And it seemed to me when I was there, and I was an outsider looking in because I was teaching primarily at Montgomery College, but I did have a short-term fellowship on the campus of Howard University in the fall of 2019. And it seemed to me that the students all got along. It's some of the very well-to-do people from the gentrifying communities around Howard University who are walking their dogs on the yard at Howard. Those white joggers who were coming through there with their dogs, they were at the center of a major movement to have them banned from Howard University when I was there, because a lot of people just thought it was disrespectful of all that Black history and culture that's associated with this institution that was founded during the Reconstruction period. So again, DC is changing. The complexion of the chocolate city is getting whiter every day, but white people, white students are welcome on those campuses of historically Black colleges. And again, the struggle continues, but I'm glad we have options as American citizens. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we need to wrap it up, but
right.
So much for this lecture, for taking so many questions and answering them, and thank everybody for being here and for your excellent questions. So this was really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Lawrence, may I ask, since I know this is being recorded, I took my glasses off, I can still see that little red light flashing, and I know this is being recorded. Will the chat be saved with the recording, or do people have to download the chat, or can someone please download the chat where there might be other questions or comments? Because I do want to write at least a scholarly article that will be published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah, absolutely. I get all of the chats are downloaded to the computer automatically.
That would be
so
great.
I can send those to you.
So thank you all for being part of this program. I really, really enjoyed it. Dr. Lawrence, you lit the fire here. You know, like Chestnut said, we need these radical thinkers in higher education who will think outside the box, and will some provide fuel for the fire, and some to fan the flames. I think Siegel is fanning the flames. And I thank you so much for doing that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for doing, you're lighting the fire. So we're doing it together. So much. Yeah. And again, thank everybody for, and the recording will be on the League of Women Voters YouTube channel after it's downloaded and we put it up there. So you'll be able to find it there probably tomorrow afternoon at the latest. So
wonderful. Yeah, because I'd like to see the other comments.
Yes.
And be inspired even more.
Yes. Good.
Thanks, everybody. Happy snow day.
Yes.
And have happy Mardi Gras, right? Is this Mardi
Gras? Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Happy Mardi Gras, and all those good things. We have, even in the midst of this pandemic, I think there are lots of things that we can celebrate in America.
Well, you need to find those things to celebrate, especially in the middle of the pandemic. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Have a good night.